think it's wine o'clock, by the way. So,
Nice. Love that for you.
okay, we're going to get started now. First of all, thank you guys so much for coming. This is sort of a new thing that we're doing in terms of having people who do interesting things come and have sort of a very informal dialogue together. And probably once a month here at the Dome. So this is only our second one. So thank you so much for
Such a pleasure.
being here. I don't know if you guys already know Rahel, but Rahel is a London-based chef who is from Indonesia, but has been very integral in like raising awareness about Indonesian cuisine and culture in a lot of Europe as well as around the world, having spent time in Australia, all over Asia, Europe, and recently voted one of London's hottest chefs. Had to throw that in there. So we're very happy to have you here.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Do you mind just like filling in the audience a little bit about what your background is, where you come from, your approach, how you sort of got involved with food? Give us a little background here.
So I guess my journey into food hasn't been a very conventional or traditional one in that I wasn't trained in culinary school. Neither was it ever a personal ambition as far as career paths goes. I never thought I would end up being in a fully fledged career in food and beverage.
Me neither.
Crazy. But it kind of happened almost accidentally / organically along the way in that when I first moved to London in 2013, it came to my awareness that the representation of Indonesian food was very limited, and the representations that did exist were either inaccurate or diluted or appropriated. And so that was what really drove that motivation in me to share that first and foremost with friends. And, I was having friends over for like dinners and cooking people dinners in my home. And friends would always be joking around being like, oh, you should open a restaurant. And I'm just like, yeah, because it's so easy to open a restaurant and I have all the money and capital in the world. And this is where a good friend of mine actually introduced me to the concept of supper clubs, which is essentially ticketed dinner parties. And, it was a very DIY way to have a large group of people together and share that food and that cuisine from my home country. And so the first one that I did was at the end of 2019. And it was mostly friends and friends of friends in attendance. And from there, it kind of just grew quite organically over the past few years. And it's kind of evolved into this whatever it is I'm doing today, which is a mixture of, I guess, cooking and also a little bit of writing, speaking about it like I am today, everything in between with the sole intention of spreading awareness and reclaiming the respect for Indonesian cuisine.
Amazing. Prior to moving to Bali, I actually didn't know very much about Indonesian cuisine. So I think, we kind of crossed paths a little bit in London because I was working there as well. So I was sort of raised my interest, and then of course we met more officially here in Bali, and it's been really nice to get to know you and see your work and your advocacy. What was sort of your initial impression of sort of the Western or European thoughts around Indonesian cuisine?
So as I touched on a little bit earlier, that limited representation that does exist in London at least, and I guess from that beyond that in the Western worlds is just a very skewed perception of what Indonesian cuisine is. And I think this roots in how unaware the large population there are about how vast Indonesia is. Some examples that I like to give is just, some anecdotes of how I would be out and about and someone would ask me, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from Indonesia. And they would ask me, oh, is that in Bali? And it's like, no, actually. And such is quite an annoying representation of how skewed that perspective of Indonesia is. And beyond that, I feel like there are, the general echoes of, people's perception of Indonesian cuisine being limited to the usuals of nasi goreng, gado-gado, satay, and the peanut sauce satay, just those three dishes over and over again. and which is why the main motivation of why I do what I do is to open kind of people's, to expose people to a lot more that exists in the cuisine.
Absolutely. And I think even I find as a foreigner and wanting to learn more about Indonesian food, coming to Bali, like the representation has also been somewhat limited to what they think foreigners want to eat, right? So like I actually wanting to learn more, where do I go? How do I find it? Because they say, okay, you want, nasi goreng or mi goreng or gado gado, right? Like those are the three main dishes. But I think it's really important to remember, like you said, the vastness of the country and the depth of the cuisine that's developed independently in each of those islands, and like highlight that.
Absolutely.
And understand, like even from place to place, like people have like look different, have different religions, have different, and understanding the diversity and the complexity of the culture, which I think gets oversimplified. Like sort of this, and another thing that you often see in Europe is like the sort of Pan-Asian thing where you have those restaurants that have like Thai, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, right? Like sort of as if all of Asia was one country, which we're all. I mean, I'm a child of immigrants as well, Chinese American, and sort of fighting those stereotypes around all of Asia being sort of similar or the same. When we have so many different you know cultures and climates and ingredients as well.
And it's not to fault, obviously, the immigrant kind of businesses being established, because people are trying to make do in a new country where they need to cater to a target demographic, and based on their understandings of Asian food, they're just trying to, make a living out of it. Sure. So it's not at all that I'm against any of these businesses, not at all. They're just trying to do what they can. But it's more of an encouragement to the wider market to seek that kind of education, to kind of like reach for those kind of interests, and to kind of like motivate the audience to be more curious about the cultures of different marginalized cuisines.
Yeah, and to be honest, like I'm one of those people that thought knew about Bali but didn't really know about anywhere else in Indonesia. So I've been obviously also influenced by that, but also coming here, part of the appeal was to really like dive a little bit deeper and see the vastness and the diversity across different islands, and how amazing that is, and how much of that I've never seen anywhere else in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hold on, let me just check
Go for it.
notes. So how have you been sort of working the work that you do to sort of advocate for greater awareness around Indonesian cuisine? I know that, like for example, some of my friends in New York, like they it's easy for them to go back to live in the country where they came from. A lot of my friends are Vietnamese, and they go back and live in Vietnam, and they have a renewed sense of pride, and then they go back and open like restaurants in New York City, and there's this whole vibrant community of that. How do you see that happening in London or Europe, or is there a sort of unified community?
Yeah, I would say even just for myself personally, I would say that I had gone through that classic diaspora experience where I took for granted kind of, the cultures and the foods around me whilst I was still in Indonesia. And it took moving to the other side of the world for me to really, truly miss what Indonesian food was. And from that, I am very privileged. And with that as well, I'm trying to, encourage those around me here in Indonesia as well to have that sense of pride over the vastness that our cuisine and our gastronomic culture is. And I do notice a lot of that as well with, other East and Southeast Asian people going back to their own countries, or the countries their heritage then reigns to back to, the respective countries they now are based in, and like bringing back and like spreading that, trying to establish that cuisine and culture that they have. That being said, I feel like Indonesian cuisine and culture isn't quite yet as established as those from other East and Southeast Asian countries. For example, Thai food, Vietnamese food, it's far more established than Indonesian cuisine is. And in fact, stuff like Malaysian cuisine and Filipino cuisine really is a lot more up and coming. And yet Indonesian cuisine somehow just hasn't quite reached that big moment it very much deserves. And for that, I
next
really
big thing.
It truly is. It deserves to be. There's so much out there that's so underrated.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's like because it's lots of different islands, perhaps it's a little bit more difficult for that sort of unity.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's extremely difficult to define what exactly Indonesian food is because when I get asked it, like how do you define something? How do you define a culture that comes from a place that is the world's largest archipelago made out of tens of thousands of different islands, hundreds of different ethnicities, and that diversity naturally reflected in the country's cuisine.
Yeah.
It's impossible because each region reflects a different kind of set of flavor profiles, a different set of cooking techniques, and yeah, like how do you define something like that?
Totally. And I think, what we're trying to do here at Calm is sort of take some of that knowledge
Absolutely.
and distill it to the obviously tourists, but really reflect like the complexity of the cuisine.
Absolutely. And in fact, something that I really love about what you guys do at Kaum is giving that, that context of origins of each and every dish that it's being served, because I feel like that is something that I strive to do through the menus that I serve up at the pop-ups or the supper clubs as well. Whenever I create a menu, I try my best to reflect a diversity of regions that the dishes come from. So a menu is never just quite Java-centric or Sumatran-centric. Different kinds of regions being reflected there really exposes the guests to a diversity of like flavor profiles, and also there's that a little bit of that educational element through the cooking that I do as well.
Right. And how have you found it really challenging working in Europe without? I mean, for me, like the ingredients really make the dishes here, and trying to recreate that authentic taste somewhere else can be very challenging, especially in Northern Europe. How have you adapted? I know you mentioned you've visited multicultural grocery stores looking for the right ingredients. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first moving to London, it was firstly challenging because there wasn't just a one-stop Indonesian shop I could visit to get every ingredient I need. It was a case of having to visit loads of different kinds of stores from loads of different kind of cultures. I guess the most immediately obvious one was to go to grocery stores from, East and Southeast Asian origins. So like, the Vietnamese stores, the Chinese stores, they most likely sell most of the base ingredients that we need because there's a lot of crossovers in the ingredients needed, like lemongrass, kaffir lime leaves, galangal, and all of that. But then there are other ingredients that I couldn't quite seem to find in these grocery stores. And it took a lot of exploration to then kind of like dig deeper into shops of other heritages. For example, starting to explore South Asian stores. And specifically with that, there's an example of how we make rendang here in Sumatra with an ingredient called asam kandis, which is essentially dried mangosteens. And in a lot of Western recipes, it would call for a substitute of tamarind, which isn't exactly the same. It's got that tanginess, And I couldn't find this specific dried mangosteen ingredient when I'm visiting these East and Southeast Asian stores. Exploring the South Asian stores or stores from from people from like India and Pakistan running it. I found this ingredient called kokum, and this took me going to the store, kind of like picking up the ingredients and kind of like scanning it in Google Translate one by one, finding out that this specific ingredient kokum was actually dried mangosteen, just like the asam kandis here in Indonesia. So that kind of applied to a lot of the ingredients I ended up working with.
Fascinating. I mean, I think that a lot of the diasporas that exist in sort of these big cities kind of united by like looking for a sense of home and looking for something that a taste or something that reminds them, and then you sort of intersect in that desire and looking for these things. I think that's
absolutely
really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know you're very good at using social media as a tool to sort of, raise awareness and talk about what you're doing. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's a funny one because I think often I get asked questions around social media or, asked to share advice or suggestions on how exactly to run a social media account. And I struggle answering that most of the time because I don't really approach it with much strategy. I'm just vibing, really. But I guess it's kind of, in a way, easier, simpler for me because my practice, or Spoons, which is, this food project, really is so much an extension of myself. So it's all quite personal. And so everything I post really comes from the heart. And as such, it's naturally quite authentic to my own voice. And, you go to my profile and it's like quite obvious that, yeah, this is a Rahel profile kind of thing, And I guess with that, the only advice I can probably give, or the only comment that I can probably share, is to, I guess, authenticity is just most important. And I know that's easier said than done, but if you're trying to replicate someone else's voice, that's just not going to come through to the audience.
Absolutely.
And that can apply to an individual or a brand.
Yeah. And in doing that, like you've mentioned to me, like, do you do you change any of the dishes when you make something somewhere else, or do you tone it down at all? And you're like, no, I'm unapologetic, which was something that I, is really important.
Being unapologetic is extremely important to me. I think that is probably what carries me through to most of my practice, and what I guess sets me apart, I guess, with a lot of other people running brands in the Western worlds. Because maintaining that integrity to me is more important than ever, especially representing a cuisine whose representation is not established. It's not established yet. So without that kind of unapologetic tone, where is it ever going to go?
Appreciate that. Where do you see your trajectory with the work that you're doing? Like, what are some of do you have like bigger dreams or goals with it?
That's a difficult as well, because as I said, I'm just vibing.
Yeah.
But everything I've done so far, I feel like has kind of fallen into place quite organically, and I'm just, trying to deliver that message and doing what I can along the way. And I'm grateful where this practice has so far brought me so many opportunities that I would never had anticipated in my life. I would never have thought that this cooking would bring me to places around the world. Like, I went to France for the first time in my life last year to cook at early June. And more of that would be incredible. So far, we've just published this zine recently, which kind of goes through a couple different recipes. It's a cookery zine. But mostly the focus of this zine talks through a lot of narrative about Indonesian cuisine from my perspective as a person born in Jakarta, rather than me claiming to be an advocate for Indonesian cuisine as a whole, because I can't be the sole ambassador for that.
Or the sole voice. Like, there's so
sole
many.
Voice,
yeah.
Exactly. I can only speak of my experience from my own lens, And apart from that, I guess a bigger goal would be like a fully fledged cookbook eventually. But with that as well, I am extremely particular about how that's conveyed, or how that would look, and the contents of that book would be, and finding the right organization or people to partner up with is extremely important to me. So I'm not in a rush at all for that to manifest itself.
Let it go organically, like
Exactly.
everything else, right?
Exactly.
What are your thoughts around, you mentioned the word appropriation, and I know that word can be sort of a very sensitive word. And like, where do we draw the line? Like, I mean, there's obviously loads of people out there who aren't from a particular origin, or didn't grow up with it, and are perhaps, let's say, a Western chef making Thai food. Or do you have any thoughts about that?
A lot.
Let's hear them.
But okay. We could be here for hours, so I'll keep it short. To me, and I think because I advocate for a lot of, context is always important to me, cultural and historical context. A lot of people mistake me as a person who's against fusion foods, for example, and that's absolutely not true.
I wanted to ask about fusion
Yes,
food.
absolutely. And the thing is, it's like, I'm not against it at all. Like, I partake in it myself. But what's most important to me is when cooking and when taking inspiration from a cuisine that's not your own, especially when that cuisine is from a marginalized culture, from, let's say, Indonesian cuisine, and you're from, I don't know, a Western country taking inspiration from my cuisine, what's most important is being aware of and communicating that cultural and historical context, making sure that you're not inappropriately using, different dishes and then recreating that without being aware of where this dish originated from. And that happens
giving credit.
a lot. And giving credit, exactly. Because doing that is honestly the bare minimum to pay respect to those cultures that you're taking from.
Absolutely. And also, I think I grew up in America, which is sort of, you have immigrants, you have multi- very multicultural.
Absolutely.
And therefore exposure to lots of different types of cuisines.
Yeah.
And, even though I'm of Chinese origin, didn't grow up cooking Chinese food, right? So I think it can be a very complex topic, but
Absolutely.
also one that, as long as you have an awareness and you are properly crediting,
Exactly.
that anyone can become, become an expert in another cuisine.
Absolutely.
Even if it's not the cuisine of their childhood or where they grew up.
Absolutely. Because without that context and without that credit being given, such is how the dilution of a culture ends up happening. And that would be really sad, especially for example, marginalized cuisine such as Indonesian food, which is yet to be established in this world.
Exactly.
And that is also how a lot of misconceptions stem from as well.
Right, exactly. And people sort of taking liberties. I mean, I think people have to understand boundaries then, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to share some of my favorite examples of misconceptions.
Sure, let's hear them.
I think my favorite ever misconception that I bring up time and again, and I'm never bored of this, is the misconception of satay, which I was so surprised when I first moved to London. I started seeing on the high street, satay rice box and satay salad, satay burger, satay this. It's like, what does that mean? Because coming from Indonesia, satay refers to a lot of our skewer dishes. And then I began to realize it was down to the equation of satay to the peanut sauce, because the only satay that people there were exposed to were the chicken peanut sauce satay.
Same.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. And that equation is why the misconception happens. And what people aren't aware of is that in Indonesia, we have hundreds of different kinds of skewered dishes or satay dishes, and a lot of which have nothing to do with peanut sauces whatsoever.
So it just means a skewered food.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So yeah, that is truly one of my favorites. And I would say that because in a lot of these kind of like fusion concepts where Indonesian food ends up being introduced, you get a lot of satay some things, and
Right.
it's often just to do with peanut sauce.
Right. It's always peanut sauce.
It's always the peanut sauce. Damn the peanut sauce.
And what about fusion? I mean, yesterday,
Yeah.
last night, Rahel cooked an amazing dinner at Lulu Bistro. And Lulu is a French restaurant. So she sort of fused French and Indonesian cuisine. Yes. Tell us more about that.
That was a really exciting one because I do admire a lot of the French cooking techniques, and like Lulu's great for the cooking that they do there. I came to taste their set menu just 2 weeks ago when I first arrived, and coming from that, I kind of just like introduced a lot of the core Indonesian flavors. Be it in the form of relishes or the different spices that we use into the kind of like French cooking techniques that they do so well, without bastardizing either.
Right.
And I think that's really important. For example, we had a gorgeous like fresh baked oyster situation with a gorgeous like
Delicious.
fried green chili relish. We had their creme caramel that we then infused with some pandan, and the caramel infused with some coffee as well. So lots of different kinds like that. And with every menu item, there's always a clear distinction of where the inspiration comes from. For example, the fried green chili relish comes from West Sumatra, etc.
Amazing. Any questions so far, guys? Oh,
Let's go, Isaac.
The same thing. I'm gonna be here, but on the same thing on the fusion, I know there was a quote on the menu, but I don't remember what it was. But it's something like paying homage to the one that's marginalized, or like the. You know what I'm talking about? On the menu yesterday, there was like a quote that was printed. I thought was so good about fusion. Maybe you don't remember.
I don't remember specifically. I've just requested a copy of that menu for myself to keep as a keepsake, actually. So I'm gonna circle back.
If you find it, it was good.
Oh, cute.
and how do you feel after you've lived outside of Indonesia for over 10 years, like coming back? Like, do you feel like the younger generation is developing this pride around like being Indonesian food? Like,
I think so. I think an interesting is that prior to starting the whole supper club, like the whole spoons thing, I barely knew any Indonesians in London. And I got to meet a majority of the Indonesians that I've met today in London or across Europe through the cooking. And I think that's beautiful because I think people see it, other Indonesians see it and they're inspired to, connect over this shared love and passion for our culture and heritage. And this doesn't even just apply to Indonesians, to be honest. Like people from other heritages of East and Southeast Asian countries, they kind of resonate with that passion, I guess, for your own culture and being unapologetic about it. And people are starting to be like, yeah, absolutely. Let's reclaim that, We want to communicate to the best we can and reclaim that respect that our culture so much deserves. And, it does deserve to be celebrated.
Yeah, I think like I said, a child of immigrants, I think there's like this tendency for assimilation.
Yes, absolutely.
And also, I grew up being very assimilated and not really relating back to my cultural upbringing until I was older, and then also was like able to meet other people of Chinese American or sort of these children of immigrants, and then we sort of solidified that we wanted to reconnect and sort of explore where we came from. So I think like the diaspora is really important in maintaining sort of that cultural identity and not just completely assimilating, but sort of respecting the fact that you can straddle the line between two different places. Because for a long time, like I didn't really feel American, nor did I feel Chinese.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
I think a lot of those bridges can be, crossed with food. Like everybody loves to eat, and
Absolutely, it's such a universal language.
and it's such a starting point for sort of for exploring.
It's
a
the
different
perfect
culture.
medium to introduce a different culture. Absolutely.
Exactly. Any other questions, guys?
I guess maybe on the note of, the diaspora experience
Yeah.
and spreading that awareness, with time, in the beginning, it's very much just like this mission to communicate and to convey that message about my cuisine and my culture and being passionate about it. But kind of like, more frequently coming back to Indonesia and reconnecting with a lot of my Indonesian friends who are based in Indonesia, I'm increasingly more careful, or I'm needing to be a lot more considerate that I'm not viewing the Indonesian culture through an external lens, if you know what I mean. There's quite a nuance around that, in that I'm not exoticizing my own culture, And I check myself quite often. I'm trying my best. I'm getting better at it. I think my sister checks up on me quite a lot. I know, it's the diaspora pill. Because it's, and I speak with my friend Sabrina, who edited the zine as well, and she checks up on me quite often as well. In that, for example, when I'm writing about Indonesian food, when I'm speaking about Indonesian food, that I'm not expressing it in unnecessary floweriness, because the food and the culture is so beautiful that it speaks for itself. And often a time, actually, when I'm doing interviews or whatever, I'd just be speaking about my experience in my country point blank. And then I see the copy that comes out and that's been edited, and suddenly it's all this thing about, oh yeah, her visit to the island of gods, oh this, that, like, oh the tropics and stuff. And I'm just like, guys, it doesn't
Editors in the UK.
way. Let's not fetishize it,
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot that I need to be quite careful about that. And I highly encourage those around me who are living in Western worlds to not feed into that as well.
Yeah, exactly. When you first started your supper club, you were vegan primarily, right?
Yes.
So that's interesting to me because as a foreigner coming here, I've been told that when we have plant-based in the cafeteria, no one wants to eat plant-based.
What kind of plant-based food is it?
Indonesian food.
Oh, damn.
So there's sort of like this, for me coming here, I think like tempeh is one of my, great things that I love here. And you really celebrate that. And of course, tempeh has also been sort of brought to this pedestal of the superfood,
Exactly.
in the Western world. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my other favorite topics. It's actually one of the main motivations, apart from being vegan at that time, to why I really wanted to celebrate that plant-based aspect of my cuisine, because tempeh itself, as you said, it's been marketed as this glamorized superfood that's like this vegan meat substitute. And what a lot of people I found didn't realize was that it had ancient Javanese beginnings, and that it was created more as a necessity than out of choice. You know, it was created because people weren't able to afford meat as a source of protein.
Yep.
And that kind of very humble origins is so ironic to this glamorized representation that it has today. And that's why I think it's extremely important to be aware of that context, because, you know, you've got all these like tempeh burgers and like tempeh steaks and tempeh, I don't know, whatever, like meat substitutes.
Sure.
And honestly, objectively, it doesn't taste as good as when you cook it the Indonesian way.
Exactly. Well, you guys have the longest history cooking it, so you know how to cook it best, right?
That's what I'm saying. And just introducing people to that, and they're always so shocked, you know, when I tell them about these origins. And I think it's extremely important because, you know, you find it sold for quite high price
Yeah.
at all these like vegan stores or organic stores that's been washed completely, greenwashed.
Absolutely. I think it's also interesting here, like Bali being this place of like wellness and supposed
hilarious to me that people-
like,
Yeah.
you know, organic everything that, you know, there's so many plant-based places here, and there's this perception that I don't know, first of all, animal protein was never historically a huge part of the diet in most countries in Southeast Asia, just because of, you know, also the costs and also the climate. So I think, you know, logically speaking, a lot of the diet was plant-based.
Yeah.
Of course, now the Indonesian places you'll find around will have lots of protein.
Yeah.
But that wasn't historically the diet.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. And it's interesting seeing how, you know, the whole industry is dipping in and out of veganism like it's a trend, when really for a lot of cultures, it's just always been there. It's
Yeah, there was
plant-based
there
foods
was
have
no
always been
dairy
there.
here.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
the thing is, with a lot of like plant-based dishes or food items in Indonesia, I feel like there's a bit of a Western perception of vegan food being, you know, less than satisfactory or less flavorful. Whereas in Indonesian cuisine, because of the depth and complexities of flavors, I personally find that it more than makes up for that lack of dairy and lack of meat. And in fact, when I first started the supper clubs, when I first started, you know, the pop-ups and stuff, and it was vegan, a lot of people didn't realize that it was vegan because I didn't heavily advertise that,
Sure.
like, I am a vegan supper club.
Right.
You know? It's Indonesian first and foremost before a plant-based supper club.
Right.
So we have people with all sorts of diets alike coming through to eat the food and only realizing afterwards that, wait, that contained no meat? Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's amazing. I think it's also like good to think about historically what the diet used to look like here,
Absolutely.
and respect that, and that they've always had a way of making everything delicious despite having access to less protein, and protein was more of an accessory rather than the main focus on the dish.
Absolutely.
And you know, so many of the world's most delicious cuisines are built like that. You know, the meat gives flavor, and it's part of the dish, but it's not like a big piece of steak and then a little bit of vegetables on the side. You know, it was actually the other way around. And
Exactly.
speaking of economy and, you know, and access, you know, which meat was more accessible to people with more money. So I think, you know, it also tells a story about history and anthropology and, you know, the landscape itself, and the fact that, you know, it's not difficult to have grazing animals. It is difficult to have grazing animals here, and therefore, like, why would you have a big steak, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So I think understanding that and also presenting that as your first like positioning of Indonesian cuisine in London was also a very interesting choice, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, it was exciting.
All right. Anything else? Anyone from the audience? Don't be shy. Sure.
Please.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the story or the thought process behind starting your thing as a supper club versus like a food truck or like a pop-up or like...
Absolutely. Totally. For sure. Because to start with, for context, when I first started, I had a full-time job at the time, and this was never a practice with the aspirations of turning it into a career. You know, it was something that I was doing on the side, something that I was already kind of doing with like smaller groups of friends, and I kind of wanted to do it slightly larger scale so I could share that with more people, and thus the concept of the supper club, because it was very much just a side project, not a profit-making exercise. And I continued doing that for About 2 years, until it kind of grew to a point where it gave me enough confidence to then quit my job at that time, which I hated anyway.
What job was that?
The last one was in advertising.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's why, as I said, the pipeline that I went through has been extremely organic, and I had never any kind of solid aspirations. I never imagined I would be doing what I am today. Still don't really know what's happening. But yeah, and to answer your questions on like bricks and mortars or something more of a physical manifestation, I still have no aspirations of opening up my own restaurant and kind of enjoying the arrangement of how I'm doing things right now, which is, popping up. Like, for context, I'm also doing more like pop-ups and residencies as opposed to the supper clubs that I used to do. That was a lot more DIY in the beginning. But I really enjoy that kind of like freedom of movement and flow and the lack of commitment. And basically what gives me the ability to like travel a lot more and travel for work. And also including a lot more different kinds of mediums as part of that hustle, and that I've started, writing about it, speaking about it, and everything in between, with the sole goal of just delivering the message of Indonesian food.
Absolutely. I think also, like, from my perspective, the opportunities for, if you're in the industry, if you're a chef, have really changed over the last 10, 15 years in terms of how you can cook and how you can have a life around food, and also have, not be tied down in the back of house, in a kitchen, and still have a voice. And in fact, perhaps a greater voice, because you have the opportunity to collaborate and to move, and not to just be physically in one place.
Absolutely. I was actually having a conversation with someone who attended the Indonesian version of the talk just now, who was trying to start a project of his own. And he was talking to me about, how he's gone around Indonesia to do his research, brought it back to Bali and showed it to his friends who work in kitchens, and how he was met with quite a lot of negative/patronizing feedback about what he was doing because it didn't really follow the traditionally culinary standards. And so I kind of told him, I myself, I don't come from a traditional culinary background whatsoever. And I personally view it as almost a bit of a silver lining in a way, because had I gone through the traditional pipeline, I feel like my perspective of how success looks like would have been a lot more skewed. I'd be working full time in a kitchen and thus unable to explore the opportunities and possibilities around what I can do through this practice,
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a gatekeeping thing, because
which definitely still exists. And I get a lot of imposter syndrome still.
I mean, we all do, even if we have done the traditional
Absolutely.
route. So I think one thing that's really inspiring, and that I wanted you to be able to communicate to both, English speakers and Bahasa speakers, is the opportunity that everyone can take in their own hands to be an advocate for what their practice is or what they believe in. And now we have more control over being able to do that with the opportunity to do residencies, pop-ups, etc. If you have a strong voice and some talent and something that you really believe in, and you no longer necessarily have to do the thing where, you work for 10 years.
Exactly.
Under, a French chef or whatever, and then you finally can make the food of your choice.
Exactly.
Right. So I think it's like it's a different world, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and to say, okay, like, how can we use this to do the things that are important to us and to speak, have our voices heard, and it gives us all a little bit more independence from the system.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really beautiful. Yes. Yeah. It was challenging for sure. It was really challenging, and it took a lot of learning, and it took a lot of tries. I was very much just learning on the go. I didn't get any kind of formal professional training. I was just faking it till I make it. But I think I'm really blessed in that I had been able to surround myself with a community of, chefs or people who work in food in London specifically, who were very welcoming and not arrogant at all with myself. There are a lot of chefs like that, gatekeepy chefs.
Yeah.
But I had been blessed to be surrounded by specifically like women of color chefs in London who have been more than supportive and like who took me on and, you know, collaborated with me. And from there, like I learned a lot, or even, you know, with Jamie, who's a mutual friend of ours, I collaborated when I first kind of started dipping into not just plant-based foods. And I told him like, hey, I really want to learn more about cooking with meat and seafood beyond like what I've been doing so far. And he said, we should work together and do like a menu together and can teach you how it goes.
I wish I could have had that menu. You did a brain, right?
We did do the brain, which was a very...
Brain with what?
Gulai. So it was like a West Sumatran curry. There's like very creamy, spiced curry situation.
I'm sure that was amazing.
With a blanched veal brain, which is actually a very traditional dish and something that I've been eating since I was 6.
Really?
So,
Brain.
Gulai otak, yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite Padang dishes. Yeah.
See, they don't give it to us outsiders.
You gotta ask for it. You gotta ask for it.
Yeah, I think you can quickly figure out who would be supportive in your community, and you'd be surprised. Like, especially, I think you're right. Like, women are usually a bit more open and collaborative, but not always. But I think like reaching out and just being really honest of who you are and saying, hey, I wanna learn and I want to work together, and you know, this is what I can bring to the table. I think just always being really honest is really the best way.
What matters is just setting those clear intentions, so no one's wasting anyone's time here. But to answer your question, for the most part, it's the people that matters, and a lot of people who, if they're supportive, they're more than willing, or they might be generous to, you know, spend that time with you and have that knowledge exchange, which for me has been integral to where I am so far, that knowledge exchange. And, you know, worst case scenario, they say, no, I don't want to help you, and that's it.
And putting yourself out there. Like, I think like, you know, part of the point of having you here is to empower people to really put themselves out there and take that risk, because I think like those voices need to be heard. And I think you're a really good example of someone who does it very well. So I want like the younger generations to like decide to, you know, have pride in where they come from.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, because I even as someone who is working here, and I've worked with a lot of local Indonesian chefs, and I'm wanting to learn from them because I'm working with ingredients that maybe are unfamiliar to me. So I'm like, okay, tell me how you clean a banana stem. And they're like, why do you want to work with a banana stem? And it's like, well, because I want to know, right? Like, I want to, this is from here, this is an ingredient that you eat, and I don't know, I don't even know where to begin with this. So having that, even though I've, you know, been cooking for a long time, I think having that, having the realization that there's always something to learn from someone else is really important it will take you very far in this industry.
Absolutely.
Anything else, guys? Don't forget to have a pandan brown.
Please help yourself.
blonde
We've got some pandan blondies
by one of her beautiful books.
as well, in case anyone's interested.
And yeah.
Yes, please. Well, because if I was just promoting it here, I'd be screaming into an echo chamber. Because we all know and love our cuisine, but, you know, spreading awareness about it outside of Indonesia is where it lacks. And I feel like I'm not, like I said, I'm not the sole ambassador for Indonesian cuisine, but I'm just doing what I can to make some noise. You know, like I still wouldn't consider myself an expert or an educator. That's quite patronizing, but at best, I would say I'm just, you know, a cheerleader for my heritage. That's it. The purpose? So that more people know about it and more people celebrate it, more people respect it, just getting the respect that it very much deserves, has always and should. You know, it deserves its big moment, and it's about time.
And also, like, I think, you know, you see all around the world, like, people who, whether it's a chef or a restaurant, it sort of brings a lot of people into that country that are coming with a different kind of understanding. It's not just here to go to, a party at Old Man's or, which you can also do. But, but
No, just
also, like, you could explore, go foraging in Tabanan in the forest and learn about tuak or learn about rice wine or so many other incredible things that exist here besides like the idea of what Bali is or
Exactly.
Indonesia in general.
Exactly. Pleasure. Yes, please. Yeah, so interestingly enough, that has been a conversation that I've been having with the tourism board for the past, since last year. Basically, we've had a few meetings to speak about specifically that, and I use Thailand as an example in that they are putting in the resources, to really get the word out there, to really promote that culture, which really is their job. And so far, I was saying that you've got, not just myself, but like other people, the diaspora in this world, doing it out of their own love for the culture. And with their support, we could achieve more. And that is why we need their support and we need their backing. And so we've just worked on something together and we're in talks of doing more projects together. But the project that I was last working on with them started off with more like a print publication, kind of just written kind of like pocket-sized booklet to speak more about and like introduce. It's like an introduction into Indonesian cuisine, which again was so difficult to encapsulate into a small piece of text. So that was, it was a starting point. We'll start with that. And now we're kind of in talks about more about, works around representation and what we can do about that, whether it can be in the form of, like promotional content or this or that. Because what I really believe in is really taking leverage from the diaspora, the Indonesian diaspora community that we have worldwide, because what the government has been working with, who they've been working with so far is a lot of these like massive influencers who are so famous domestically. And then, like as I said earlier, if you're using these influencers who are very well known domestically, we're just again screaming into an echo chamber. We need to get the word out there. They need to start working with communities outside of Indonesia, Indonesian communities outside of Indonesia, to really get the word out there. It doesn't necessarily have to be like hyper famous, like macro celebrity influencers, but the volumes in those communities are what can really work out.
I mean, there's a pretty sizable community in the Netherlands, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
But I personally don't really know of anything coming out of that in terms of, like there's nothing I've seen or heard.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like, again, with the Netherlands, obviously they colonized us and therefore there's a big population there and a big kind of established Indonesian food scene there. But again, it kind of stays there when there's so much potential of bringing that out of there to the rest of Europe as well, It's like literally next door. So yeah, there is a lot of potential there and definitely things cooking up and hopefully, really, really hoping that it'll manifest some way effective.
Thank you, Rahel.
My pleasure.
That was beautiful.
Thank you so, so much.
Thanks everyone for coming. And if you have any other questions, feel free to just...
Yeah, hit me up.
Thank you.